March of 1885, London. The corridors of St Thomas Hospital reeked of disinfectant and death. Young nurse Clara Thompson carried her tray past room 12. Inside, a man was dying. Dr. Jonathan Michael Hartley, 60 years old, respected surgeon, retired from the British Army. Lung cancer was slowly consuming him. Doctors had given him 2 weeks at most. Clara had grown accustomed to this reality. Death was an ordinary visitor in these corridors. But that morning, something extraordinary happened. Senior nurse Sarah Elizabeth Bennett was walking down the corridor. She was 59 years old, had worked at this hospital for 35 years. Her hair was completely grey, her hands calloused with experience. Sarah approached every patient with the same professional distance. But that morning, when the door to room 12 stood open and she glanced inside, she froze. Her face went white. Her breath caught. The tray in her hands nearly fell. Clara rushed over. "Nurse Bennett, are you all right?" Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the bed in the room, the man lying there, his face collapsed from illness, his breathing rattling, one step from death. Sarah's lips trembled. She whispered a single word so quiet Clara couldn't hear. "Margaret?" That night Sarah couldn't sleep. In 35 years of nursing, nothing like this had ever happened. But that face, those hands, the look in those eyes, it was impossible. Margaret Rose Ashford had disappeared 40 years ago, never found. Sarah had searched, had waited. But Margaret must have died long ago, or she was far away, living another life. But that man, Dr. Hartley. Sarah couldn't wait for morning. The moment her night shift ended, she went to room 12. She opened the door slowly. Inside, only candlelight. Dr. Hartley was sleeping, his breathing heavy, irregular. Sarah approached the bed slowly. She looked at the man's face, beneath the lines of illness, beneath the lines of age, beneath the beard. Sarah's hand trembled. She reached out to touch, then pulled back. Dr. Hartley's eyes opened. Two people in darkness looked at each other. Sarah's voice failed her, but her lips moved. I know you." Tears streamed from Dr. Hartley's eyes. He nodded slightly. "Yes." Sarah staggered backward. Had to lean against the wall. 40 years. 40 years they'd worked in the same hospital. 40 years they'd met every day, talked, been colleagues, and Sarah had never known. Dr. Hartley, no, Margaret tried to speak. His voice was raspy, weak. "Sarah, forgive me." But Sarah couldn't speak. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She wanted to cry, but her tears had frozen. She could only ask one question. Why? Margaret, no longer Jonathan, no longer doctor, just Margaret, tried to give the answer she'd wanted to give for so long, but words weren't enough. 40 years couldn't be explained with a single answer. "Because," said Margaret, her voice breaking, her breath failing, "because I couldn't bear to lose you." Sarah stood there in the darkness like someone seeing a ghost, and Margaret began to tell her a story 40 years in the making. The Yorkshire countryside was golden in the summer of 1835. Wheat fields rippled in the wind, children's laughter echoed between stone-walled houses. In a small village, two families lived side by side, the Ashford family and the Bennett family, and each family had a daughter. Margaret rose. Ashford was 10 years old. Her dark brown hair was always messy because she refused to wear a bonnet. Her knees were constantly scraped because she climbed trees with the boys. Her mother scolded her as little troublemaker. Her father secretly smiled with pride. But both saw that strange light in Margaret's eyes. Questions, curiosity, refusal to accept. Sarah Elizabeth Bennett was 9 years old. She was Margaret's opposite. Quiet, compliant, a girl who did whatever her mother said. Her hair was always neatly arranged, her dresses always clean. But when she saw Margaret, her face lit up, because Margaret showed her another world, a world that didn't follow rules, that knew no boundaries. The two girls were inseparable. Every morning they walked to school together, every afternoon they played together, every evening they returned home together. The villagers called them the twins. They were like real sisters. But Margaret had other plans in mind. At 12, she found a medical book in her father's library. Inside were human anatomy, diseases, treatments. Margaret smuggled the book to her room, read for hours under lantern light. Sarah helped her, went outside to make excuses, covered for her when her mother looked for Margaret. When Margaret turned 14, she told her father, "I want to be a doctor." Mr. Ashford had laughed, thought it was a joke. But when he saw the seriousness in Margaret's face, his laughter faded. "My dear," he'd said, his voice both gentle and firm. "Girls cannot be doctors." "Why not?" Margaret's voice was full of protest. "Because that's how it is. God created women to be wives and mothers, men to be doctors, lawyers, soldiers." "But I'm intelligent," Margaret insisted. "I understand the books. I can learn treatments." Mr. Ashford shook his head. "Your intelligence doesn't matter, Margaret. Your sex does, and you are a girl. Girls marry, bear children, care for husbands. This is your fate." That night Margaret cried. Sarah held her. Two young girls sat under an old oak tree. Margaret's tears wet Sarah's shoulder. "It's unfair," Margaret whispered. "Why can't I live the life I want?" Sarah didn't know. No one knew, because in 1839 England women were property. First their fathers, then their husbands. They had no claim to their own lives, but Margaret didn't accept it. At 16 she secretly wrote to the University of Edinburgh, wanted to apply to medical school. The answer was short and harsh. "We do not accept women." Margaret tore up that letter. But she didn't give up. At 17 she wrote another letter, this time with a man's name. Jonathan Michael Hartley. The answer was different. "Your application is under consideration." Margaret showed that letter to Sarah. Two young women, no longer girls, counted as adults now. And something between them had changed. It wasn't just friendship anymore. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. In Victorian England, love between two women could not be spoken. It had no name, or if it did, saying it wasn't permitted. But Margaret and Sarah knew that silent truth. On summer nights, when everyone slept, they would meet in secret. By the river, where no one could see, they would hold hands. Words weren't necessary. Glances were enough. But Margaret knew this couldn't last. When autumn 1843 arrived, Margaret's family made a decision. Mr. Ashford had decided to marry off his daughter. He'd found a candidate, a wealthy merchant, 35 years old, widowed, with 2 children. Margaret refused. Her father insisted. The household peace shattered. Arguments, shouting, slamming doors. One night, Mr. Ashford gave Margaret an ultimatum. "Either you'll marry, or you'll leave this house." Margaret went to Sarah. The two young women didn't speak that night. They just held each other. They knew. Their time was running out. "Let's run away," Sarah whispered. "Together. Somewhere far. No one will find us." Margaret smiled, but sadness filled her eyes. "Where? How can two women live together? Who will give us work? Who will rent us a house?" Sarah didn't know, because there was no answer. In the Victorian world, two women being together was impossible. That night Margaret made a plan. She told no one, not even Sarah. Because she knew Sarah would try to stop her. Margaret's plan was insane, dangerous, but it was the only way out, and to carry it out she would have to leave Sarah. Forever. The winter of 1844 was merciless. Snow fell early, roads closed, the village was isolated. Margaret had turned 19. The wedding date had been set. Spring. Margaret counted every day. 3 months left. 90 days. Then her freedom would end. But something happened. In December, on the night the blizzard was fiercest, the village doctor died. He was old. His heart gave out. The village was left without a doctor. Mr. Ashford sat in his library, reading medical books. Margaret entered. Her father looked at her. His daughter had changed. No longer the rebellious girl. She'd become cold, determined. "Until we get a doctor," said Margaret, her voice flat and businesslike. "I can care for the village. I've read your books. I know the treatments." Mr. Ashford wanted to object. But outside the blizzard howled. The nearest town was 2 days away. There were sick people in the village. "Only simple things," her father said. "Bandages, fever reducers. If anything serious happens, we'll bring a doctor from town." Margaret agreed. And for the first time she had the chance to use her medical knowledge. Sarah helped her. Together they visited patients. Margaret diagnosed, Sarah bandaged. The two women were a perfect team. The village was amazed. Margaret set Mr. Wilson's broken arm. Sarah brought down Mrs. Harper's fever. Margaret stitched little Tommy's cut wrist. A week later, gossip started in the village. Ashford's daughter is as good as a doctor. But the praise didn't make Margaret happy, because she knew it was temporary. When spring came, she would marry, and this would end. In January, Margaret told her father something else. I applied to the University of Edinburgh, to medical school. I was accepted. Mr. Ashford froze. What? Under whose name did you apply? Margaret didn't answer. Her father slammed his fist on the table. This nonsense will end, Margaret. You will marry. You will care for your husband. The doctor game is over. Margaret looked at her father. No tears in her eyes anymore, only cold determination. Yes, father, she said. You're right. The game is over. That night Margaret came to Sarah. For the last time, snow was falling. Two women sat by the window in candlelight, silent. Margaret held Sarah's hand. I love you, she said. It was the first time she'd said it. The words had been forbidden, but it didn't matter anymore. Sarah cried. Me too, always. Forgive me, Margaret whispered. But she gave no explanation. Sarah didn't understand. Why was she asking for forgiveness? She would learn the answer a few days later. January 18th, 1845. Margaret Rose Ashford disappeared. In the morning when her mother went to her room, the bed was empty. The window was open. Snow tracks led toward the garden, then vanished. Margaret was never seen again. But that same day in Edinburgh, a young man registered at medical school. His name was Jonathan Michael Hartley. No one asked where he came from. No one noticed the strange softness in his face. And Sarah, in the Yorkshire village, searched for Margaret for days, went to the lake, to their old meeting places, screamed, cried. But no answer came. Margaret had died, or so it seemed. The truth was Margaret had just been born. As Jonathan, Edinburgh was cold. Stone buildings blocked the sky, streets smelled wet and dirty. Jonathan Michael Hartley was 20 years old and playing the greatest role of his life. The first day was terrifying. When he entered the medical school's great hall, 100 men looked at him. None suspected. His chest had been flattened with bandages, hair cut short, voice deliberately lowered, walk, posture, gestures, all carefully altered. Margaret had died. Jonathan was alive. The first weeks were torture. In changing rooms, dining halls, dormitories, every moment carried the risk of discovery. Every morning Jonathan looked in the mirror and reminded himself, I am a man. I have always been a man. Margaret was just a dream. But at night, alone in his room, Margaret was still there. He thought of Sarah, her face, her voice, her touch, and every time his heart shattered. But he couldn't go back, because going back meant death. The first year was hardest. Classmates tested Jonathan. Masculine games, drinking contests, invitations to brothels. Jonathan politely declined them all. I'm religious, he'd say. I don't drink. Some respected this, others mocked. But no one suspected, because in Victorian England it would never occur to anyone. Could a woman perform such a perfect masculine disguise? By the second year, Jonathan began to relax. The role now came naturally. He lowered his voice without thinking. His walk had become automatic. His gestures were masculine. Margaret's remnants were fading. But one thing didn't change. His passion for medicine. Jonathan was the best student in his class. Anatomy, physiology, surgery. Excellent in all. His professors praised him. Hartley is a born surgeon, they said. They didn't know that Jonathan's hands were so precise because he'd once embroidered with needle and thread as Margaret. In 1848, Jonathan graduated, top of his class. But finding work was difficult. London hospitals didn't hire inexperienced doctors, so Jonathan applied to the British Army. The army didn't ask questions. They needed a young, competent, graduated doctor. Jonathan was accepted. Rank, surgeon lieutenant. And so Jonathan Michael Hartley, female-bodied but male-identified doctor, went to war. India would change Jonathan. There, amid blood and death, the last traces of Margaret would disappear, and Jonathan would become a real man. Or so he thought. Spring 1849. Jonathan boarded the ship. 6 months' journey across the Indian Ocean. 100 soldiers, 10 doctors, 1 woman. But no one knew. On the ship, Jonathan lived in close quarters with other male doctors for the first time, shared a cabin, ate meals, fought seasickness. He had to be careful every moment. Taking off shirts was forbidden, bathing was postponed, toilet only when alone. But the hardest part was evening conversations. Men talked about women, lovers, wives, mistresses left behind, crude jokes, sexual experiences. Jonathan listened, smiled, stayed silent. "Why does Hartley never talk?" one doctor asked. "Shy," said another. "First time abroad." Jonathan accepted this lie. Shyness was the best defence. When they arrived in Bombay, Jonathan was shocked. Heat, crowds, poverty. He'd seen nothing like it anywhere in London. The army camp was outside the city. Tents, weapons, soldiers. Jonathan was assigned to a small hospital tent. There he would treat cholera, malaria, dysentery. When the first patient arrived, Jonathan was ready. A young soldier, burning with fever, trembling. Malaria. Jonathan diagnosed it, gave quinine, brought down the fever. The soldier survived. The second patient was worse. Cholera, diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration. Jonathan gave fluids for hours, adjusted medication. But the patient died. Jonathan witnessed a human death for the first time. He was shocked, but he couldn't cry. Because men didn't cry, at least not in front of other doctors. That night, alone in his tent, Jonathan wept silently. Margaret was still there, deep in his heart, the gentle girl who couldn't bear death. But when morning came, Jonathan washed his face, put on his uniform and went back out. Because there were more patients, and he had no time to suffer while playing his role. In 1851, Jonathan experienced something that would change him forever. A woman was giving birth. The baby was breech. The midwife was helpless. Jonathan was called. When he entered the tent, the woman was screaming, blood, sweat, tears. The midwife looked on helplessly. "The baby will die," she said. "Maybe the mother too." Jonathan hesitated. Male doctors didn't interfere with childbirth. This was women's work. But now the midwife was asking for help. Jonathan approached the bed, looked at the woman's belly, felt the baby's position. Breech. Feet first. Natural birth was impossible. "Caesarean," said Jonathan. The midwife was shocked. But that kills the mother. If we don't, both will die. Jonathan had never performed a caesarean, but he'd read about it in books, knew it in theory. Now he had to apply it. He washed his hands, disinfected the knife, took a deep breath, and began to cut. It felt like hours. In reality, 20 minutes. Blood, internal organs, the baby's small body. Jonathan guided everything carefully. The midwife helped, assistants shouted, and then a cry was heard. The baby! It was alive. Jonathan handed the baby to the midwife. Then he stitched the mother. Layers, stitches, bandages. A week later, the mother stood up. The baby was nursing. Both were alive. Word spread through the camp. Hartley performed a miracle. But Jonathan knew it wasn't a miracle. It was knowledge. And the courage to use that knowledge came from watching his mother give birth when he was Margaret. Jonathan stayed in India for 5 years. In those 5 years, he saved hundreds of lives. But he couldn't save one life, his own true identity. Margaret was dying a little more each day, and Jonathan didn't know if this was a good thing or a tragedy. In 1854, the Crimean War began. The British Army withdrew soldiers from India, including Jonathan. New assignment, Sevastopol, Crimea. The ship journey took 3 months. Jonathan was now 30. He'd lived as a man for 10 years. It was no longer a role. It had become identity. Crimea was cold, bloody, and merciless. War brought hundreds of wounded every day. Hospital tents had become hell. And there Jonathan met another woman, Florence Nightingale. Florence had brought her nursing team, 30 women to improve hospital conditions. The British Army initially objected. What use are women on a battlefield? But Florence insisted, and got permission. When Jonathan first saw Florence, he felt something strange. Recognition. Because Florence was also a woman fighting in a man's world. But Florence was openly a woman. She wasn't hiding. The two worked in the same hospital tent. Florence cared for the wounded, Jonathan performed surgeries. A silent rivalry developed between them. One day, Florence asked Jonathan, "Why have you never married, Dr. Hartley?" Jonathan gave his prepared answer. "No time. The profession comes first." Florence looked at him with sharp eyes. "Or another reason." Jonathan felt uncomfortable. Had Florence sensed something? Impossible. No one had figured it out in 10 years. But Florence's gaze was penetrating. That night, Jonathan looked in the mirror. He could no longer see Margaret. The face had changed. Lines, beard shadow, actually makeup, hardness. Margaret had completely vanished. And Jonathan realized something. He didn't mourn her. In spring 1855, the war ended. Jonathan returned to England. His rank had risen. Surgeon captain. Medals adorned his chest. He was a respected doctor of the British Army. But when he landed in London, his first thought wasn't the war, not the medals. It was Sarah. 10 years. Sarah was now 34. Was she married? Did she have children? Or was she still waiting? Jonathan didn't know, and he was afraid to find out. Because if he saw Sarah, if he spoke to her, Margaret might return. And if Margaret returned, Jonathan would die. But fate had other plans. When Jonathan returned to London, he was assigned to St. Thomas Hospital. It was a famous hospital beside the Thames River, gleaming white stone buildings. Here England's best surgeons worked. On his first day, Jonathan toured the hospital corridors. Everything was spotless. No chaos like India, like Crimea. This was civilization. The head nurse met him, an elderly woman, stern, professional. "Dr. Hartley, welcome. I'll explain the hospital rules." Jonathan listened. Work hours, surgery schedules, nurse relations. Everything was orderly, regulated. "Our nurses are very experienced," said the head nurse. "Our most senior is Sarah Bennett. She's been here 15 years. You can trust her." Jonathan's heart stopped. Sarah Bennett. The same name. But there were thousands of Sarah Bennetts in England. It didn't have to be the same person. "Shall I introduce you?" the head nurse asked. Before Jonathan could answer, a woman appeared in the corridor. 34 years old, nurse's uniform, hair pinned up. Her face. That face. Jonathan's breath caught. It was Sarah. 15 years later, she'd changed. No longer a girl, a woman, but her eyes were the same. Those gentle, sorrowful eyes. Sarah looked at Jonathan, smiled kindly. "Dr. Hartley, welcome. I look forward to working together." It was her voice. The same voice. 15 years hadn't changed it. Jonathan tried to speak, but no sound came. He coughed, recovered. "Thank you, Nurse Bennett." The voice was different. A man's voice. Sarah noticed nothing. Two people, 15 years later, 1 metre apart. One recognised, the other didn't. Sarah turned, walked down the corridor. Jonathan stood there, his heart pounding wildly. The head nurse smiled. "Bennett is an excellent nurse. You're fortunate." Jonathan said nothing. Was he fortunate or cursed? Jonathan couldn't perform surgery that day. His hands were trembling. His mind was on Sarah. 15 years. He'd tried to forget Sarah for 15 years. Now he'd see her every day, and Sarah would never know. The first week was torture. Jonathan and Sarah worked together every day. Surgeries, rounds, patient visits. Sarah was professional, kind, competent. Jonathan never dropped his mask when speaking with her. But at night, alone in his room, Jonathan looked in the mirror and wept. Sarah seemed happy. She hadn't married. He wondered why, but couldn't ask. Maybe she had a fiancé. Maybe she was just focused on her profession. Or maybe she was still waiting for Margaret. Jonathan couldn't bear this thought. The second month got slightly easier. Jonathan settled more into his role. When talking with Sarah, he no longer trembled, just felt a slight ache in his heart. One day, Sarah assisted Jonathan in surgery. A difficult case. Appendicitis. Jonathan would remove it surgically. Sarah handed him instruments, prepared bandages. The surgery was successful. The patient survived. Then Sarah turned to Jonathan. "You have excellent technique, Dr. Hartley. Where did you learn?" Jonathan answered carefully. "India. War. Practice comes from necessity." Sarah nodded. "War must be terrible. It is? Was your family worried? Jonathan hesitated. I have no family. Compassion appeared on Sarah's face. I'm sorry. I'm alone too. My family died long ago. Two people, both alone, drew a bit closer. But Sarah didn't know that the man beside her was the girl she'd lost 15 years ago. Years passed. 1856, 1857, 1858. Jonathan and Sarah worked together every day. They became colleagues, became friends. Sarah trusted Jonathan. Jonathan loved Sarah. Still, always. But he couldn't say it, because saying it would destroy everything. In 1860, an incident occurred at the hospital. A young nurse, Mary, was secretly seeing a doctor. It was forbidden. Nurses had to remain unmarried, couldn't break the rules. Mary was caught, fired. The doctor only received a warning. Sarah was outraged by this injustice. Mary lost her job, but that doctor is still here. It's not fair. Jonathan listened. The anger in Sarah's voice was the same as Margaret's anger. 15 years ago, when she'd shouted, "Why can't girls be doctors?" Jonathan asked carefully, "Have you ever wanted to marry Nurse Bennet?" Sarah hesitated. Once, long ago, but that person left. Did they die? I don't know. Disappeared. Never found. Jonathan's heart clenched. Are you still waiting? Sarah smiled, but sadly. No, that person won't come back. I've moved on with my life. But Jonathan saw. There was still expectation in Sarah's eyes, still hope, and Jonathan knew that hope would never be realised. 1865 arrived. Jonathan turned 40. His hair began to grey. Sarah was 41. They weren't young anymore, but they were still side by side, and no one knew. Two former lovers, 40 years later, were walking the same corridors. One remembered, the other didn't know. In 1870, Jonathan noticed something. Sarah looked tired. She was coughing, had a fever. Are you ill? Jonathan asked. Sarah smiled. Just a cold. It'll pass. But it didn't pass. 2 weeks later, Sarah was worse. Jonathan insisted, You should see a doctor. You're already a doctor, Sarah said. Jonathan looked at her, examined her, touched Sarah. It was impossible, but necessary. He checked Sarah's pulse, measured her fever, listened to her lungs. Each touch was torture, because 15 years ago he'd held these hands with love. Now he was examining as a doctor. Diagnosis, bronchitis. Not serious, but rest was needed. Go home for a week, Jonathan said. Rest, Sarah objected. But the patients, I'll manage. You rest. Sarah bowed her head. Thank you, Dr. Hartley. You're a good person. Jonathan said nothing, because he wasn't a good person. He was a liar. He'd been lying for 45 years, and his biggest lie was to Sarah, I am Jonathan, Margaret is dead. In autumn 1870, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't bear it anymore. Seeing Sarah every day but not being able to tell her the truth, this wasn't living, it was torture. Jonathan applied for full retirement from the British Army. It was accepted. When Sarah heard the news, she was surprised. You're leaving? Yes, I'm old. I want to rest. Sarah looked sad. I'll miss you, Dr. Hartley. You've been a wonderful colleague for 15 years. Jonathan didn't smile, couldn't smile. I'll miss you too, Nurse Bennet. He left, went home, and never returned to the hospital. But he couldn't forget Sarah, because forgetting was impossible. When Jonathan retired, he moved to a small house. Outside London, a quiet neighbourhood. No one knew him. No one asked questions. He was 50 now, an old man, a respected surgeon, but hollow inside. Days passed monotonously. Morning coffee, afternoon walk, evening books. No friends, no visitors, only loneliness. Sometimes former patients would send letters, thank you letters. You saved me, Dr. Hartley. Jonathan would read them, smile, then burn them, because he knew he'd saved others but couldn't save himself. In 1875, Jonathan turned 60. His hair turned completely white, his back bent, his hands trembled. One day he looked in the mirror. The person he saw was completely Jonathan. No trace of Margaret. 50 years. 50 years of a role. It was no longer a role, it had become real. And Jonathan realised he didn't miss Margaret. When Margaret died, he'd been freed. He'd become a doctor, saved lives. If he'd remained as Margaret, he would have married, had children, lived an ordinary life. But as Jonathan had made history. Was it worth it? Jonathan didn't know the answer. In 1880, Jonathan fell ill. Coughing started. Shortness of breath. He went to a doctor. Diagnosis: lung cancer. How long? Jonathan asked. 5 years, maybe less. Jonathan nodded. 5 years. Enough. The illness progressed slowly. First year, Jonathan could still walk, read books. Second year got harder, breathing hurt. Third year, Jonathan was bedridden. In 1884, Jonathan wrote his will. No property or wealth, just books, a few clothes, and a chest. What was in the chest? He'd never opened it, but he knew. Margaret's things, old photographs, letters, a lock of hair. Jonathan wrote in his will, "The chest must be burned. No one should see its contents." In early 1885, Jonathan could no longer walk. He needed a nurse. But better to stay in a hospital than at home. He returned to St. Thomas Hospital. 15 years later, but this time as a patient, he was placed in room 12. Young nurse Clara would care for him. Jonathan lay in bed, looked at the ceiling. This was his final stop. And then he thought of Sarah. Was she still here? She was 60. Maybe she'd retired. Maybe moved to another city. Or maybe she was still here. March 1885. Jonathan was dying. Doctors had given him 2 weeks. Painkillers weren't working. Every breath was torture. But Jonathan didn't care about the pain. Because one morning the door opened and Sarah walked in. 40 years later, 2 lovers side by side again. And this time Jonathan knew. He had to tell the truth. Because before dying, Sarah had a right to know. When Sarah saw Jonathan, she froze. In the corridor that morning, the door had been left open. The man lying inside, his face was familiar, but how? That night Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind was confused. Dr. Hartley had left 15 years ago. Why had he returned? Why as a patient? But the real question, why did he seem so familiar? The next day Sarah went to room 12. Jonathan was sleeping. Sarah quietly approached, looked at his face, hands, eyes, lines. Something awakened in Sarah's memory. A face from 50 years ago, Margaret's face. Impossible! But Sarah reached out her hand, touched Jonathan's hand. He woke. 2 people looked at each other. Sarah's voice trembled. "You..." Tears poured from Jonathan's eyes. He nodded. Sarah staggered backward. "No, it can't be. Margaret died 40 years ago." "She died," Jonathan whispered, "and Jonathan was born." Sarah collapsed, sat on the floor. Her hands trembled. 40 years. You were here 40 years, beside me, and you never told me. I couldn't tell you. Why? Jonathan closed his eyes. Because I couldn't bear to lose you. If I left as Margaret, I'd never see you again. But as Jonathan, at least I could be beside you, Sarah cried, silently in pain. Didn't I have a right to know? You did, but I chose cowardice. Sarah looked at him. Was it anger on her face? Sadness? Both. 40 years of lies, Sarah said. Her voice was broken. 40 years I talked with you, worked with you, laughed with you, and you were always a liar. Yes, you said you loved me that last night, remember? I remember. Was it a lie? No. Jonathan's voice was clear. Never a lie. I loved you. Every day. 40 years. Sarah shook her head. She couldn't believe it. Didn't want to believe it. But those eyes were Margaret's. Sarah came back that night. And the next night. And the night after. Every night when Jonathan woke, Sarah was there. They talked. Remembered the past. How Margaret had escaped. How she became Jonathan. How she studied medicine. India. Crimea. London. 40 years of life compressed into 1 week. Sarah asked questions. Jonathan answered. Sometimes Sarah cried. Sometimes Jonathan. Sometimes both stayed silent. March 20th, 1885. Jonathan was very weak. Talking was hard, breathing hurt. Sarah held his hand. Do you regret it? Jonathan thought. No, I wanted to be a doctor. I became one. I saved lives. As Margaret, I couldn't have done these things. But were you happy? Jonathan hesitated. No, because I lost you. Sarah shed tears. I lost you too, 40 years ago. And now I've found you, but I'm losing you again. Forgive me. Sarah shook her head. I'm angry at you, because you lied. But at the same time, I understand you. The Victorian world gave us no choices. Jonathan smiled. What about you? You didn't marry. Why? Sarah answered, because I waited for Margaret. Thought she might return. Foolish, wasn't it? No, beautiful. Two people, hands clasped, sat in silence. March 28th, 1885. Jonathan's final day. Breathing came with difficulty. Sarah waited at his bedside. Jonathan tried to speak. His voice barely emerged. Sarah, tell me something. Yes? Bury me, as a man, as Jonathan, not as Margaret, Sarah cried. But you're Margaret. No, not anymore. I was Jonathan for 50 years. That's my truth. Sarah nodded. All right, you'll be buried as Jonathan. Thank you. Jonathan closed his eyes, took his final breath, and died. Sarah stayed there, held his hand, cried. Young Nurse Clara entered. Nurse Bennett, has he died? Yes. Clara approached to check the pulse, but she stopped, because she saw Jonathan's chest, the bandages. Clara was shocked. This... Sarah quickly stood. You won't tell anyone. But he is Dr. Jonathan Hartley, a respected surgeon. He saved lives for 40 years, and he'll be buried as a man. Clara was uncertain. But the truth doesn't matter. What matters is he saved lives. And now, let him rest in peace. Clara slowly nodded. I understand. Sarah unwound the bandages, straightened Jonathan's body, cleaned him, dressed him in his uniform, and that night, no one knew. Dr. Jonathan Michael Hartley was buried as a man. On the tombstone, Dr. Jonathan Michael Hartley, 1825 to 1885, surgeon who saved lives, rest in peace. Sarah didn't cry at the funeral, just stood silently. Everyone mourned for Jonathan. No one knew Sarah was mourning Margaret. The year 1900. Sarah Bennett was 74, she'd retired, lived in a small house. Young nurses would visit her. Tell us about the old days, Nurse Bennett, Sarah would tell them, about the hospital, doctors, surgeries. What was Dr. Hartley like? A young girl asked. Sarah smiled. The best surgeon and the most loyal friend. Did you ever marry? No. Why not? Sarah hesitated. Because I once loved someone, and that person left. I couldn't love anyone else. The young girl asked curiously, who was that person? Sarah didn't answer. The year 1905. Sarah died, 90 years old, peacefully, in her sleep. In her will she'd written, bury me beside Dr. Hartley, and she was buried. Two tombstones side by side, Dr. Jonathan Michael Hartley, 1825 to 1885, Sarah Elizabeth Bennett, 1826 to 1905. No one knew. Two lovers, 40 years apart, together forever, and the truth was buried with them. But in 1920, something happened. A young historian was researching medical history, found Dr. Hartley's records, British Army files, Edinburgh graduation records, and noticed an inconsistency. No birth record, no family record. Jonathan Michael Hartley had suddenly appeared in 1845, as if he'd never been born. The historian investigated and finally found Margaret Rose Ashford, disappeared in 1845, never found. The historian made the connection, but there was no proof, only suspicion. He wrote his article, Mysterious Doctors of the Victorian Era, but no one believed it. Impossible, they said. A woman couldn't be a man for 40 years. And the file was closed. Margaret and Jonathan's secret was protected. Forever. Margaret and Jonathan's story ends here. 40 years of a role, 40 years of love, and finally, a truth spoken on a deathbed. But hundreds more secrets lie buried in the dark corners of Victorian England. Every confession spoken on a deathbed. Every lie carried for years. Every truth forgotten forever. If you want to continue discovering these kinds of stories, please like this video and subscribe to Victorian Secrets Untold, because in the next video I'll take you to another deathbed Another confession, another forgotten life. And this time, the confession might be even darker, because some secrets can only be spoken with the final breath.